Hi Mathews Superstars, it's Mrs. R and I am here at Mathews and I thought maybe today we should read a little more of George's Marvelous Medicine. Are you ready? Do you remember where we left off? George had just given the doses to the animals and the animals had grown to all sizes and it looked like, kind of crazy, right? Because Alma the goat had completely grown huge. Looks like the size of a horse, right? So, A Crane for Grandma is our next chapter. Grandma, from high up on the rooftop, could see everything that was going on, and she didn't like what she saw. She wanted to be the center of attention, and nobody was taking the slightest notice of her. George and Mr. Cranky were running around and getting excited about the enormous animals. Mrs. Cranky was washing up in the kitchen, and Grandma was all alone on the rooftop. "Hey, you!" she yelled. "George, get me a cup of tea this minute, you little brat!" "Don't listen to the old goat," Mr. Cranky said. "She's stuck where she is, and a good thing, too." "But we can't leave her up there, Dad," George said. "What if it rains?" "George!" Grandma yelled. "Oh, you horrible little boy, you disgusting little worm! Fetch me a cup of tea at once and a slice of currant cake." "We have to get her out, Dad," George said. "She won't give us any peace if we don't." Mrs. Cranky came outside, and she agreed with George. "She's my own mother," she said. "She's a pain in the neck," Mr. Cranky said. "I don't care," Mrs. Cranky said. "I'm not leaving my own mother sticking up through the roof for the rest of her life." So in the end, Mr. Cranky telephoned the crane company and asked them to send the biggest crane out to the house at once. The crane arrived 1 hour later. It was on wheels, and there were 2 men inside it. The crane men climbed up on top of the roofs and put ropes under Grandma's arms. Then she was lifted right up through the roof. In a way, the medicine had done Grandma good. It had not made her any less grumpy or bad-tempered, but it seemed to have cured all of her aches and pains, and she was suddenly as frisky as a ferret. Here's a picture of the crane. As soon as the crane had lowered her to the ground, she ran over to George's huge pony, Jack Frost, and jumped onto her back. This ancient old hag, who was now as tall as a house, then galloped over the farm on the gigantic pony, jumping over trees and sheds and shouting, "Out of my way! Clear the decks! Stand back, all you miserable midgets, or I'll trample you to death!" and other silly things like that. She's pretty huge, and so is that pony. But because Grandma was now much too tall to get back in the house, she had to sleep that night in the hay barn with the mice and rats. Mr. Cranky's great idea. The next day, George's father came down to breakfast in a state of greater excitement than ever. "I've been awake all night thinking about it," he cried. "About what?" George asked him. "About your marvelous medicine." "Of course, we can't stop now, my boy. We must start making more of it at once, more and more and more." The giant stewing pot had been completely emptied the day before because there had been so many sheep and pigs and cows and bullocks to be dosed. "But why do we need more, Dad?" George asked. "We've done all our own animals, and we've made Grandma feel as frisky as a ferret, even though she does have to sleep in the barn." "My dear boy," cried Mr. Killy Cranky, "we need barrels and barrels of it, tons and tons. Then we will sell it to every farmer in the world so that all of them can have giant animals. We will build a marvelous medicine factory and sell the stuff in bottles at $10 apiece. We will become rich, and you will become famous." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said. "There's no waiting," cried Mr. Cranky, working himself up so much that he put butter in his coffee and milk on his toast. "Don't you understand what this tremendous invention of yours is going to do to the world? Nobody will ever go hungry again." "Why won't they?" asked George. "Because one giant cow will give 50 buckets of milk a day," cried Mr. Cranky, waving his arms. "One giant chicken will make 100 fried chicken dinners, and one giant pig will give you 1,000 pork chops. It's tremendous, my dear boy. It's fantastic. It'll change the world." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said again. "Don't keep saying wait a minute," shouted Mr. Cranky. "There isn't a minute to wait. We must get cracking at once." "Do calm down, my dear," Mrs. Cranky said from the other side of the table, "and stop putting marmalade on your cornflakes." "The heck with my cornflakes," said Mr. Cranky, leaping out of his chair. "Come on, George, let's get going. And the first thing we'll do is to make one more stew pot as a tester." "But, Dad," said little George, "the trouble is—" "There won't be any trouble, my boy," cried Mr. Cranky. "How can there possibly be any trouble? All you've got to do is put the same stuff into the pot as you did yesterday, and while you're doing it, I'll write down each and every item. That's how we'll get the magic recipe." "But, Dad," George said, "please listen to me." "Why don't you listen to him?" Mrs. Cranky said. "The boy's trying to tell you something." But Mr. Cranky was too excited to listen to anyone except himself. And then he cried, "When the new mixture is ready, we'll test it out on an old hen just to make sure you've got it right, and after that we'll all shout hooray and build a giant factory." "But, Dad—" "Come on, then. What is it that you want to say? I can't possibly remember all the hundreds of things I put into the pot to make the medicine," George said. "Of course you can, my dear boy," cried Mr. Cranky. "I'll help you. I'll jog your memory. You'll get it in the end. You see if you don't. Now then, what was the very first thing you put in?" "I went to the bathroom first," George said. "I used a lot of things in the bathroom and on Mummy's dressing table." "Come on, then," cried Mr. Cranky. "Up we go to the bathroom." When they got there, they found, of course, a whole lot of empty tubes and empty aerosol cans and empty bottles. "That's great," said Mr. Cranky. "That tells us exactly what you used. If anything is empty, it means you used it." So Mr. Cranky started making a list of everything that was empty in the bathroom. Then they went to Mrs. Cranky's dressing table. "A box of powder," said Mr. Cranky, writing it down. "Helga's hair set, flowers of turnip perfume. Terrific. This is going to be easy. Where did you go next?" "To the laundry room," George said. "But are you sure you haven't missed anything in there, Dad?" "That's up to you, my boy," Mr. Cranky said. "Have I?" "I don't think so," George said. So down they went to the laundry room, and once again Mr. Cranky wrote down the names of all the empty bottles and cans. "My goodness me, what a mess of stuff you used," he cried. "No wonder it did magic things. Is that the lot?" And here they are upstairs in the bathroom. "No, Dad, it's not," George said. And he led his father out to the shed where the animal medicines were kept and showed him the 5 big empty bottles up on the shelf. Mr. Cranky wrote down all their names. "Anything else?" Mr. Cranky asked. Little George scratched his head and thought, but he couldn't remember having put anything else in. Mr. Killy Cranky leapt into his car and drove to the village and bought new bottles and tubes and cans of everything on the list. He then went to the vet and got a fresh supply of all the animal medicines George had used. "Now, show me how you did it, George," he said. "Come along, show me exactly how you mixed them all together." Next chapter, Marvelous Medicine number 2. They were in the kitchen now, and the big stewing pot was on the stove. All the things Mr. Cranky had bought were lined up near the sink. "Come on along, my boy," cried Mr. Killy Cranky. "Which one did you put in first?" "This one," George said. "Golden Gloss hair shampoo." He emptied the bottle into the pot. "Now the toothpaste," George went on, "and the shaving soap, and the face cream, and the nail polish." "Keep at it, my boy," cried Mr. Cranky, dancing around the kitchen. "Keep putting them in. Don't stop, don't pause, don't hesitate. It's a pleasure, my dear fellow, to watch you work." One by one, George poured and squeezed the things into the stewing pot. With everything so close at hand, the whole job didn't take him more than 10 minutes. But when it was all done, the pot didn't somehow seem to be quite as full as it had been the first time. "Now what did you do?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Did you stir it?" "I boiled it," George said, "but not for long, and I stirred it as well." So Mr. Cranky lit the gas under the pot, and George stirred the mixture with the same long wooden spoon he had used before. "It's not brown enough," George said. "Wait a minute, I know what I've forgotten." "What?" cried Mr. Cranky. "Tell me quick, because if we've forgotten even one tiny thing, it won't work, at least not in the same way." "A quart of brown gloss paint," George said. "That's what I've forgotten." Mr. Killy Cranky shot out of the house and into his car like a rocket. He sped down to the village and bought the paint and rushed back again. He opened the can in the kitchen and handed it to George. George poured the paint into the stewing pot. "Aha, that's better," George said. "That's more like the right color." "It's boiling," cried Mr. Cranky. "It's boiling and bubbling, George. Is it ready yet?" "It's ready," George said. "At least I hope it is." "Right!" shouted Mr. Cranky, hopping about. "Let's test it. Let's give some to a chicken. My heavens alive! Why don't you calm down a bit?" Mrs. Cranky said, coming into the kitchen. "Calm down!" cried Mr. Cranky. "You expect me to calm down, and here we are mixing up the greatest medicine ever discovered in the history of the world? Come along, George. Dip a cupful out of the pot and get a spoon, and we'll give some to a chicken just to make absolutely certain we've got the correct mixture." Outside in the yard, there were several chickens that hadn't had any of George's Marvelous Medicine #1. They were pecking about in the dirt in the silly way that chickens do. George crouched down, holding out a spoonful of Marvelous Medicine #2. "Come on, chicken," he said. "Good chicken, chick, chick, chick." A white chicken with black specks on its feathers looked up at George. It walked over to the spoon and went peck. The effect that medicine #2 had on this chicken was not quite the same as the effect produced by medicine #1, but it was very interesting. "Whoosh!" shrieked the chicken as it shot up 6 feet into the air and came back down again. Then sparks came flying out of its beak, bright yellow sparks of fire, as though someone was sharpening a knife on a grindstone inside its tummy. Then its legs began to grow longer and longer and longer. Its body stayed the same size, but the two thin yellow legs got longer and longer and longer still. "What's happening to it?" cried Mr. Killy Cranky. "Something's wrong," George said. The legs went on growing, and the more they grew, the higher up into the air went the chicken's body. When the legs were about 15 feet long, they stopped growing. The chicken looked perfectly absurd with its long legs and its ordinary little body perched high on top. It was like a chicken on stilts. "Oh my, sainted aunts!" cried Mrs. Killy Cranky. "We've got it all wrong. The chicken's no good to anybody. It's all legs. No one wants chicken legs." "I must have left something out," George said. "I know you left something out," cried Mr. Cranky. "Think, boy, think. What is it that you left out?" "I bought it," George said. "What was it? Quick!" "Flea powder for dogs," George said. "You mean you put flea powder in the first one?" "Yes, Dad, I did. A whole carton of it." "Then that's the answer." "Wait a minute," said George. "Did we have brown shoe polish on our list?" "We did not," said Mr. Cranky. "I used that too." "Well, no wonder it went wrong," said Mr. Cranky. He was already running to his car, and soon he was headed down the village to buy more flea powder and more shoe polish. Well, Mr. Cranky is certainly very enthusiastic about making the medicine and changing the world and feeding everyone, which is a very kind thing to do, right? But don't you think they're going about it all wrong? Class, what do you think is going to happen next? Do you think they'll be successful in producing, what is it now, George's Marvelous Medicine #3? We'll have to find out next week. In the meantime, be sure to check out our Scholastic Book Fair that's still going on this week. I'll put a link down in comments that you can click on, and it's very self-explanatory. I'm sure your teacher has already explained it to you. This year we're having a Scholastic Book Fair featuring books such as Roald, Dahl, and many, many, many others. And check it out. Some of the books are under $5. All of the books will be shipped directly to your house, so they will not be coming to Mathews. They'll go right from Scholastic to your house. And for every 4 books that you guys buy, I get to buy one for Mathews Library. And there's a whole lot of new books that are out there that I would love to purchase for our Mathews Library shelf so I can read them to you. And eventually when you guys return to the library, you guys can check them out as well. In the meantime, superstars, stay safe and have a fabulous week ahead. I'll see you next week. Bye.